Level frets are critical for a good playing guitar. If your frets are not level, whether it's due to wear, seating issues, bad fretboard prep from the factory, it's not going to be possible to execute a good setup on that instrument. You're always going to be working around the different fret heights. If you set your guitar to have a nice low action, you're going to have fret buzzing. It could be localized. You could have fret buzzing all over the board. But the foundation of any good playing guitar is proper fretwork and level frets. The best time to check your frets for level is after a setup. Once you've set your guitar up to play the way you want it, the easiest check is just to play it. And if you have no fret buzz, then your frets are definitely level within the tolerance that you need. If you set your action lower and then you start developing buzzes here and there, you're going to need to go in with a set of measuring tools and actually check each fret one at a time to determine how out those frets are and if you need to do a spot level or if you need to do a full level on the entire neck. So playability issues would be your first sign that you have a problem with your frets. So what I will do is I will just fret every note and just play every note. You can just do a chromatic scale up the fretboard, and already I'm hearing a pretty good fret buzz on a few frets. So I'll play all the way up the fretboard, play every note, and listen for any choked notes just when you're playing single notes. Then another important area to check is on your E, B, and G string, just kind of depending on where you bend. You want to check and make sure that your notes bend without fretting out. So we've got a fretting out note when we bend on the 19th fret. So we're going to want to go in and check the 20th fret for level. So I've identified a couple of areas where I do have buzz. I've got a pretty good amount of buzz on this 3rd fret. So after bending on my 19th fret and finding that I'm fretting out there and then playing on the 19th fret across and hearing all that fret buzz, I probably have a high 20th fret. So we're going to get in and inspect that. The main thing that will guide you as far as whether you need fretwork or not is, does the guitar play well for you? If all your notes bend cleanly, if all your notes sound cleanly and sustain, then your guitar does not need fretwork, so it's playing fine for you. But if, like on this guitar, you do find that you're having some issues around the note cleanliness, whether or not it chokes, it buzzes out, then you need to go in and do your evaluation. So we'll do our initial evaluation of these frets with the strings on the guitar, then we'll take the strings off if we need to go further than that. After you've done your setup and you have the guitar playing exactly where you want, if you do have fret buzz, you can cheat around it by raising your action. So that will raise the strings up so that they clear the high frets, and the guitar will sound better, but it's not really going to play the way that you want it to. So what we want to do is really want to dial this thing in so that you can play it at a nice, low, comfortable action that you really like and not be limited by the quality of the fretwork. I want to put you in the driver's seat as far as making the frets perfectly level so that you can set your guitar up exactly how you want it. So now that the guitar is all set up and I've identified a couple of problem areas, I'm going to move into the evaluation and assessment of the frets. So in collaboration with MusicNomad, we have developed an innovative system that will help demystify the process of identifying problem areas in your fretwork and will also allow you to correct those problems. So for the initial stages of evaluation, we're going to need 2 tools. We're going to need our MusicNomad Fret Rocker Plus, which is a really great tool for not only checking the level of your frets, but it's also an action gauge. So you can check your string action above your 12th fret. It has a pickup height ruler, some useful information around setups and specs that you might need to use whenever you're setting up your guitar. But it's all precision ground, and you have 4 edges that will span 3 frets at any point on the neck. So it's the tool that you'll need to identify anywhere that you do have a high fret. As we were developing this tool, a couple of things that we considered were how the tool actually fits in your hand and how the tool balances. A lot of the common fret rockers out there, whenever they're used in certain positions, it is not balanced well. It hangs off to one side. So on this fret rocker, no matter how you're using it, the tool is always centered above the fret that you're rocking, so it's really easy to use. And it's nice and thick. It's a lot thicker than a standard string action gauge, so it has a good weight to it, and it just feels very precise. And the sister product that goes along with the fret rocker is the MusicNomad Fret Gauge. Now this is a really important set of measuring gauges whenever you're getting into fret work. So with this tool, you have the ability to measure first your fret level. So in conjunction with the fret rocker, we have a 1.5 thousandths feeler gauge that you will use with the fret rocker to see if your frets are within tolerance. Once you have determined whether or not they are, you can use the next size up, which is a 4 thousandths feeler gauge, to slide under the fret or push against the edge of the fret to determine whether or not your fret is seated against the fretboard. So fret seating is really important. The fret could have just popped up, and that's why it's not level, but this gauge will give you the ability to determine that. So once you have figured out that your fret's not level, whether it's seated correctly or not, you're going to want to know, do I have enough fret to actually level my frets? Because you can't really level them past a certain point. They become very unpleasant to play. It becomes very hard to crown. So you have a 24 thousandths thickness feeler gauge here that you will use in conjunction with the fret rocker to determine, do I have enough fret height to actually level my frets? Once you've determined that your frets are not level and you need to crown them, you can use this fret size gauge to determine how wide your frets are. So this will drop down over a fret that's 94 thousandths of an inch wide or narrower, and it will rest upon a fret that's wider than that. So once you've determined the size of your fret, whether it falls inside this gauge or outside the gauge, that information will give you the ability to choose the correct size crowning file to crown the fret after you've leveled it. I'm going to go ahead and use my fret rocker to identify high frets in the areas where I was experiencing problems. Now if you have a guitar that's given you, more than a couple of problems, you might want to just go ahead and rock every fret at every string location and just get a global overview of the fret quality of that instrument. On this, I'm only really having a couple of spots that are standing out. My 3rd fret on my low E string, and then my 19th fret up in the high register. So I'm going to focus on those two areas primarily. The fret rocker is a pretty simple tool. It is just a straight edge that's going to allow you to find any frets that are high in relation to the frets next to them. So the way that you use it is there are 4 different length sides. So the longest side will be used down in the low register. You want to span 3 frets at a time only. Not 4, not 2, 3 frets. So in the low register, you're going to use the long side. And as you get farther up the neck, the frets are going to get closer and closer together. So you'll flip over and use the next size. Then as you get up farther, you'll want to use the short edge here. And then as you get even farther up on the extension, you can flip it over and use the shortest side so that you maintain that 3 fret span all the way up the fretboard. So knowing that I have buzzing whenever I'm fretting on the 3rd fret on the low E string, I would expect my 4th fret to be high. If you have a fretted note that's buzzing, it's going to be the next fret towards the bridge that's high typically. It could be the following, could be a hump, but most likely it's going to be the next fret up is going to be higher. So since I'm buzzing at the 3rd fret, I'm going to check the height of my 4th fret. And sure enough, it is rocking at the 4th fret under the low E string. So I know that I'm out of tolerance because it is buzzing, but I'm going to go ahead and use my fret level gauge to check to see if the fret is measurably out of tolerance. So the way that I'll do that is I'll put my rocker on my 4th fret and I'll rock it to one side or the other. I'm just going to rock it to where it's resting on the 5th fret, and then I'm going to take my level gauge and I'm going to see, does it fit under the rocker? And it does. So it goes in between the fret and the rocker, which tells me that my fret is beyond 1.5 thousandths out of level. And that's typically where you start seeing, or hearing, where you typically start hearing buzzing on a guitar that's set up to play comfortably. If you're under 1.5 thou out of level, typically won't really show too much of an issue. So I know I'm going to need to level this 4th fret down. Now I'm going to go up here and check my 20th fret, because I have a fret buzzing on the 19th fret that's very pronounced, and it also is fretting out when I bend on the 19th fret. So I'll use my short side to come up here, and I'm going to rock that fret. So it's fine on the high E side, but then as I get into the D, it's really high at the D string, the A string. It's very high all the way across, and then it's fine on the low E again. So that's a good example. Frets can just be all over the place. I mean, it might be the whole fret's high, it might be one spot. You just never know. So that's why it's important to check your frets under every string at each fret. You want to check all 6 string lies so that you know you might have just a little spot that's popped up in the middle, and so you want to be sure that doesn't get past you. So now I have determined that my fret is high all the way across the middle. So now that I've identified my heavy rock on the 20th fret, I'm going to bring in my level gauge, and I'm going to just check that and determine if it's measurably out. And the gauge easily goes underneath the fret rocker. So I am well out of tolerance of level. Now the reason that we designed the gauge this way is that we know that a fret that is just barely out of level probably not going to cause a problem. If I went over this entire guitar, I'm probably going to find a few frets here and there that I can get just a little bit of a rock on, but there's no buzzing issue, there's no fretting out, they're not causing any problem. So what we were really looking for is what is the spec, the measured spec that actually impacts the playability of the instrument. And we found that once you start getting over 1/1000th of an inch, definitely over 1.5 thou, you're going to start having buzzing. So now I've determined that I have frets that are not level, and in order to get the guitar to play the way that I want it to, I'm going to have to go farther with my evaluation and do some fret work on it. So I'm going to go ahead and remove the strings so that I'll have access to the frets, and then I can do my further diagnosis, and then I can do my leveling. So now I have my strings off, and I have access to the frets, and I can do any evaluation or fret work that I need. Now because this guitar has been set up properly, I'm not going to make any truss rod adjustments. I'm just going to assess the frets with the neck as it is. So now that I have determined that my 4th fret is high, I want to check to see if the fret is seated. So I'm going to use my seating gauge to see if I have a gap between the fret crown and the fret board. So a properly seated fret will make contact with the fretboard all the way across from the bass side to the treble side. There won't be any gaps in the middle. Very commonly, you can have a fret that will spring up in the middle. If it was over radius before it was pressed into the fretboard, over time it will spring back and lift in the middle, so you'll have a gap in the middle. Sometimes frets that get hammered in, the ends will spring up and you will have the middle tight, but the ends will have gaps. So it could kind of go either way. Sometimes you'll just have one end up, so it could be anything. But typically that happens because either the frets were improperly installed, they weren't glued, it could be excessive humidity, the fretboard has shrunk, just any kind of problem between the fret tang and barb interface with the fretboard can cause the fret to lift. So I'm going to go ahead and check with my seating gauge to see if I am seated on the bass side of this fret. And it is seated really well. This gauge does not go under at all. And I can then, since I know the fret's seated, I can check to see if it's solidly in the fretboard by tapping on it with my fret rocker. Now what I'm doing is I'm listening for a nice, hard, solid, clear tone when I tap on the fret. If you tap on the fret and it sounds hollow, if it doesn't have a crisp sound, then you know that your fret is loose and you might need to press and glue that fret. But this fret is seated and it is very well glued into the fretboard. So I'm not going to need to do any pressing or gluing on this fret. So now I'll move up to my 20th fret, which I know is high in the center of the fretboard. And I'll grab my fret seating gauge and I'll come in against the edge of it. Oh yeah, this one actually does go under the fret right in the area that it's high. So the gauge goes all the way into the tang, underneath the A and the D string, and over across almost to the G. So this fret is probably popped up. So now I'm going to go ahead and just give it a gentle tap to hear if it is actually glued or if it's just popped up. The fret sounds very solidly in the board all the way across, so my guess is that whenever they pressed the fret and glued it, they just didn't get it all the way down, or it sprung back up before the glue dried. But with it solidly in the board like that, I'm not going to try to press it in any farther because it's solid in the board. If you have a fret that's lifted and is high and it sounds hollow, then you're going to want to press that fret down. Either take it to your local luthier if you don't feel comfortable doing that, or you would use a pressing caul, or sometimes you can use a dowel and a hammer. But you'll need to get that fret down to the board and glued in so that you can level it. But it might not even need to be leveled. If you push it back down to the board and glue it, that might be the only reason that it was high. So I have my two obviously high frets. As I was checking the rest of the board, I did find a couple that were within tolerance, but were still definitely a little bit of a rock on them. And I've got some playing wear, particularly first three frets on this guitar, and just they're a little bit flatter than I would like to see on up here. So I'm going to go ahead and level all these frets and just take out my high 4th and 20th and touch up all the fret tops so that I'm ready to recrown them properly. So now my next step is going to be to determine, do I even have enough fret material to level? If you level frets down below a certain point, not only are they hard to crown and hard to clean up after the leveling process, but they're just not very fun to play. It's very hard to bend notes on low frets, and it can be hard to fret a clean note because the pad of your finger will hit the wood before the string is clearly ringing on the fret top. So I'm going to use my fret height gauge, my number 3 on my fret gauge here. So what I'll do is I'll put my fret rocker across 2 frets, and then I'll slide the gauge between the fretboard and the fret rocker. And I have a lot of room here. These frets are well within leveling height. I will be able to level these frets out and still have a really good fret height for good playability, good clean note, good bending, and this will work out really well. Now that I've determined that I have the proper height, I'm going to want to know what my fret width is. So I'm going to use my fret width gauge on the end of the handle here. I'm going to go ahead and just set this down over the fret. And what I'm seeing is that this is actually rocking on the fret. It's not going all the way down to the fretboard. So that means the fret itself is wider than this channel. Now that means that I'm going to need to use a wide crowning file to crown these frets after I've leveled them. If the fret gauge went down and touched the fretboard, then I would know that I needed to use a narrow crowning file to crown the frets. Yeah, one of the cool things about the gauge is there's a legend right on the handle to show you how to use it. It shows you to place the gauge right over the fret, and then it tells you exactly what file you're going to need to use depending on whether the gauge rests on the fret or it rests on the fretboard. So it really takes a lot of the guesswork out of determining what tools you need to complete the job. So I think you can see that we put a lot of thought and effort into making the fret rocker and the gauge as a system to work together to allow you to diagnose your fret condition on the same level as a pro would do. I've been doing fret work for 23 years now, and I'm really proud of these tools, and I think that the accuracy that they deliver is going to give you the ability to make your frets so good that you can set your guitar up any way you like.
For more videos on how to perform guitar setups or care for your frets, subscribe to our channel and visit musicnomadcare.com for all our products and how-to videos.